All right. This is class 4 for Music History in Lit 1. This is for the class week of September 7th, 2020. And this is in lieu of regular class meeting. I'm going to post this on Canvas. If you're watching it from Canvas. And this is in lieu of class, not having class on Labor Day. I hope you had a great Labor Day if you're watching this, or if you're having a great Labor Day, maybe in watching this class. I hope this doesn't make it too painful for you. We're going to go over we're going to go over chapters 8, 9, and 10 with this lecture. I'm not going to get terribly deeply into what the text says. I'll leave that up to you to read. I have updated all of the words that you should be studying. And those words, it doesn't mean that I'm going to ask you the term or ask you that word, but when you go to answer perhaps an essay, you might find that knowing those individual words will make it easier for you to answer the essay. We're going to talk a little bit about the test before we get into the class. As I say, so the terms are updated and the listening is updated through chapter 10. So there are, again, no listening assignments for chapter 7, but there are for chapter 8, 9, and 10. So you should pick 2 pieces from each of those chapters, and you should do your listening journal entry for that. And that'll be due Saturday, the regular time, which is, I think Saturday is the 12th. Okay, now there's no assigned essay for this week. I figure the test will be enough for you. So don't worry about putting in an essay. Just worry about doing your 3 chapters, a total of 6 pieces for your listening journal. Again, that's due Saturday. And of course, your exam is due the following day, midnight. All right, let's talk a little bit about the test. The test, as I say, is fairly complete right now, and I might modify this a little bit, but it's 20 terms for you to define, 5 composers, and 5 essay questions. And I'll be posting this certainly by Monday, Labor Day, by the 7th. So if you're watching this and you're watching it Sunday evening, this will go up Sunday evening, September 6th. Then you can certainly look for the test. The test might even go up tonight, so keep an eye on it. The test will be available in Canvas. You should be able to log into the test. There's no time limit on it. So you should be able to log into the test, work on it. It should save down at the bottom of your test. It'll have something that says, there'll be a button, and the button that says submit quiz. Don't push that button. If you push that button, it submits the quiz to me for grading, and it locks the test. So do not push that button until you're completely finished with the test. Once you're finished with the test, you hit submit quiz. Now, next to the submit quiz button is a little statement, and it says this was last saved such and such a time. So, matter of fact, I'm looking at the quiz right now, and it says last saved at 2:49 p.m., which just happens to be 2:49 p.m. on Sunday afternoon. So what I'm saying is this: you should be able to open the quiz and work on it, and you should be able then to exit the quiz, and it should save your work. And then when you're all done with the quiz and you're ready to hand it in, you're ready to submit it, just hit submit quiz, and that should take care of it. In the meantime, what I would do, again, do not push that button until you're ready to actually submit it for grading. What I would do if I were you is, or actually what I'd do if I were me, if I were taking this quiz, I would answer one term, because you should be able to do that in about 2 minutes. I'd answer one term, put that brief definition down for the term, exit Canvas, and then come back to the quiz and make sure the term information was saved. That way you know that you are saving your information. Now, if you're worried about it, you can always do this on a Word document. And if you want to, you can, I mean, I prefer you to submit it through Canvas, because it'll make it more uniform for me to grade. But you can always do this quiz on a Word document and then move the stuff over, cut and paste into Canvas for each of these answers, and that's fine too. That might be a simpler way to do it. All right, so the quiz will be up shortly. And let me give you a few things here, and this is all at the top of the quiz. I'm reading right off the quiz now. It's due Sunday evening, the 13th, by midnight. I've got all the information about don't press submit quiz until you're ready to submit it for grading. There are 3 parts: terms, people, and essays. Normally, okay, for the terms, there are 20 terms. I think this test, if you are well prepared and you've been studying your terms, this test should take you about 2 hours to complete. If you haven't read your book, it's going to take a lot longer. If you haven't done that, if you haven't already looked at the terms, studied the terms, read through the book, understand the big picture stuff that's going on, it'll take you all week. But if you have studied for it, you do know the terms, you're going to blow through this test. It's very simple if you know the material. 20 terms. All I am looking for, look at me. Do not write a tome, do not write a book answer for these terms. Okay, if I give you a term like jonglier, and that's not on the test, but if I gave you that term, you just give me a very brief definition. This is who it was in France at this time. It should be 1 sentence, 2 sentences at the most. It shouldn't take you more than 2 minutes if you're a slow typer to answer that term. Okay, if I give you a term yeah, let me see if I can take some terms off of here so I don't confuse you too much. Leader. If that's a term, you'd write, and it's not on your test, but if it were on your test, you'd put German for song. German song in from the Renaissance, term from the Renaissance, and then Obrecht wrote Lieder, okay, or one of the German composers, Handel, not Handel, but Handel, or one of those guys wrote Lieder. Okay, fine. So you could just put what the term means, maybe a period that it's from. If it's like chanson, that's French for song. French for song term starts out over here in this style period and continues. All sorts of French composers. I don't need I mean, you can put Michaud, but it's any French composer. You pick virtually any French composer. They all wrote chanson. So that's what I want. I want 1 or 2 sentences for the terms. If you do that, the terms, 20 terms, if you are a slow typist, you will get them done in under an hour. If you labor it, every term you go to your book, you look up in the index, and you can do this, but you look up in the index, you find the chapter, you read through it, you're going to spend 10 minutes on every question. It'll take you hours just to do the terms. That's not what I'm looking for. I'm looking for a 1 sentence or 2 sentences at the most definition for each of these terms. If I wanted an essay for it, I would write an essay. I just want a definition. Got that? Okay. Now, And the reason I'm making a big deal about this is because some of you are going to try to write a bunch of information on these terms. I don't want to grade that. I just want a definition so I know that you know what the term is. And part of the reason of this test and the way I'm setting it up for you is that I'm making it a learning experience. If you're looking at this, the terms I've given you are straightforward terms that you should know coming off the first half of class. So if I ask you about the Reformation, you should be able to tell me about the Reformation. If I ask you different types of masses, you should be able to say, oh yeah, there's this kind of an imitation mass, there's a cyclical mass, there's this kind of mass, there's a, and you should be able to say this kind of mass is this. You don't have to tell me the history of masses. All I'm asking for is a definition for that particular type of mass. Okay, so you should be able to tell me things like what cantus firmus is, or what musica ficta is, if I ask you what is an isorhythmic motet, I'm not asking you to tell me what a motet is. I'm asking you to tell me what an isorhythmic motet is, specifically. That's a motet that has this. There's a specific element that makes an isorhythmic motet an isorhythmic motet. And for those of you who've studied it, you're going to go, I studied 17 hours a night for this test. This is going to be an easy test. And for those of you who have no idea what I'm talking about, if you can't tell me what an isorhythmic motet is right now off the top of your head, this test is going to take you some time. So, but that's all I'm looking for. Okay, Gregorian chant. If I ask you about Gregorian chant and I want 250 words, I want an essay. If I'm asking for Gregorian chant and I want a definition, it's 1 or 2 sentences. Clear? Please do not write books for the book length answers for the terms, please. So there's terms. Now, I am going to ask you about composers. Now, the terms are all 5 points. The composers are 10 points. I want more information for the composers. For the composers, who, what, when, where, why. Now, probably not why, but who is a composer? When did they live? What did they write? Why are they important? Okay, there are some composers that are truly, for instance, we'll briefly touch on Palestrina today in the lecture. Palestrina is to the Renaissance what J.S. Bach is to the Baroque. If you were stuck on a desert island and somebody said, you get to bring one composer's music with you and it has to be from the Renaissance, the answer is Palestrina. Palestrina's music is beautiful. It is what we think of when we think of Renaissance church music. So Palestrina, if I put Palestrina, you're going to put, again, I'm not looking for Palestrina's biography. I'm looking for, just tell me who Palestrina is, who he was, when he lived, maybe where he's from, and what he wrote. He wrote church music, predominantly church music. As a matter of fact, I think he probably wrote a few things on the side, but basically masses and motets, that's what he wrote. And so just put that down. And it doesn't have to be, if you want to write it as an essay, you can, but I'm not asking it as an essay. I'm just asking for the information. Tell me who this guy is and tell me why he was important. Okay. So the information, the bio stuff is simple. You know, where he's from, when he lived, where he worked, maybe. But why he's important is what I'm looking for. I want you to tell me, why is this guy important? Well, I just told you why Palestrina is important, but you can go into more of that. What exactly did he do? And again, I'm not looking, he didn't do 1,000 different, well, he may have done 1,000 different things, but the things that he's most important for, 2 or 3 things, and you'll find it in the Palestrina section, but if you've studied Palestrina and you've read the book, you already know the answer to that, okay? So it's not a big deal. So the big name composers of the first, let's say, through the 1600, basically, because Palestrina goes up to about 1600. So all of that, I'm going to ask you 5 composers, and I'm asking you because they're some of the main composers. So I've already told you who's going to be on that list. Okay, basically by saying that. Actually, it's composers and people, because I did put one guy on there who wasn't a composer, but he is important. Then there are the essays. This is how you do an essay question. First of all, no essay over 250 words. If you want to write a full essay and write 250 words, and there's only 5 of them, okay? There's 5 instead of, I was going to put 8 or 9, but I only put 5. Again, you're going to finish this test in 2 hours if you've been studying. The essays, no longer than 250 words. So what I want you to do is read the question, the essay question. On all of these things, answer the question. Don't guess. I'm not trying to fool you. I'm not trying to trick you. Answer the question. So read the question. This is how you do the essays. You read the question, and then before you do anything else, do a brain dump. Read the question, and then write down everything that you remember from studying. And you're going to have a list of items, okay? And then when you get done with that list of items, if you feel fairly confident that you've got pretty much the stuff that you want to talk about, then start writing your essay, 250 words max. Now that's not, I need 250 words for each essay. If you can write the essay in 57 words, hallelujah, it's easier for me to grade it. On some of these essay questions, you might get right to the point, and it might not take more than 50 or 60 or 70 words. On other questions, your challenge is going to be, what stuff do I leave out of the 250 words? And that's okay. So the question that I asked once upon a time was the major events that happened in the first 1,000 years of Christianity that impacted Western music. Constantine, Charlemagne, Gregorian chant. You could end with Ars Nova. I mean, there's a huge amount of stuff that happened, but your job is to narrow it down to just maybe 2, 3, or 4 items and briefly talk about those items. 250 words means that what I'm looking for are just some big ideas about what happened. Okay, so don't. And what I'm grading this test. I'm giving you the opportunity to do this test, open book, open notes, open terms. I'm giving you the opportunity to do the test this way, though there's a part of me that's a little worried because it means that you can go back and over-research this. That's not what I'm looking for. The book does not go into depth on anything. All of these things, if you're going to talk about Ars Nova, you could write a book on Ars Nova. People have. I'm not looking for a book length answer on if I asked you about Ars Nova. I'm looking for 250 words. Just hit the main points. So you're going to read the question, jot down everything that comes to mind before you look at anything else. Don't open the book, don't do anything. Jot down the stuff that you already know. Then I want you to reread the question a second time to make sure you're going to actually answer the question. So many times people go to answer questions and they don't end up answering the question. They just give me a lot of stuff that's not pertinent to what I asked. I'm trying to make stuff as clear as possible. Answer, give me the information I'm asking for. That's all I want. I don't need anything extra. It doesn't have to be perfectly written. The danger of taking a test this way, if you're in the classroom and you have 2 hours, you're gonna plow through it. You're gonna write stuff down, and you're not gonna look back. The danger of taking a test the way we're taking it right now is that you have the opportunity to check your work. That's going to slow you down if you let it. I am grading it as though you're sitting in the class and you're not going to reference your book. That's how I'm grading this test. So you can take it that way. If you have studied, listen, if you have studied the material, don't even bother to open your book. You won't need it. Just take the test and you will be done in 2 hours. If you are a ditherer, or if you get too worried about stuff and you go back to start reading through and double checking yourself, it's going to bog you down. I'm asking you not to do that. Though, if you need to check a fact or check a date, I don't have any problems with that. Okay, but and you don't have, when you put, like for Palestrina, I don't need the day the year he was born and the year he died. I just need when he was writing. Okay, Palestrina was late Renaissance. That's enough. I don't need anything more than that. I know when he lived. I know when he was born. I know when he died. I just need to know that he's a late Renaissance composer. Okay, so Michaud's 1400s, mid 1300. I'm sorry, 14th century. Michaud's 14th century, mid 1300s. That's all I need to know about Michaud in terms of when he lived. Okay, he was French, and he lived, 14th century, and he did this, and he did this. Okay, that's all I need to know. All right, so I've got some other stuff here. I want you to have fun with the test. Fun with the test. Yeah, I want you to have fun with the test. So I want you to understand why this music is the way it is and how it impacts the music that we make today. So that's the whole purpose of even taking the class. So as you work through this, don't get hung up on it. Don't get stressed out. I know that there's some of you that's like, if I say that, I know I'm talking to the wind, but it's important to just focus on, just give me the information I'm asking for. Okay, so no essay for this week. We have 2, 4, 6 journal, music journal entries you're going to do by Saturday. Your research paper topic is now overdue. If you have not given me a topic, get it to me now. I need it now. Okay, I need to reserve it, and and I can tell you, Hildegard is taken. Let's see who else. Maybe I can give you some. Doctrine of Ethos is taken. The development of music notation, that's taken. The monks are open again. Okay. Bach is taken. Leonin is taken. So those are all subjects you can't write about. Now, if you want to write about the Ars Nova, you can certainly do that. There's much to write about. But, as a matter of fact, I think Ars Nova is taken, actually. I think somebody asked about that. I just haven't written it down yet. So, first come, first serve. Once you reserve a topic, then it's off the table for anybody else. All right? And let's get notes back up there. Okay, and this is where I would normally ask if there are any questions, but I'm going to assume by that there's the fact that nobody's listening that I'm not going to get a response for that question, or that you're watching this after I've already recorded it. Okay, so let's get moving on things. Let's see, anything else? If you're watching this, and I hope you're watching this by Monday, but if you're watching this later in the week, do not wait until the last minute to take the test. Do not wait until Sunday night. Just get it done, okay? As I say, I want you to do, what I'm looking for is information should not go beyond what's in the book. So if you go to some other source, if you wiki it, if you Google it, the way that's going to get you in trouble is you're going to give me information that I'm not asking for. It is a waste of your time. And it's also, you could also blow the test up. So for instance, if I ask you about madrigals, I'm asking you about madrigals. I'm not asking you about the madrigals that we haven't studied yet, the 16th century madrigals. We haven't gotten to those madrigals yet. I'm asking you about 14th century madrigals. They're different. They're not the same animal. So if you see madrigal on the test and you Google it, you're going to end up with the wrong answer. Don't do it. Don't Google. Don't check out. Your book is your source, books and notes. Okay, that's it. Do not check out anything online. Let's see. If you haven't already joined a study group after this test, you'll definitely want to reconsider that. Let's get started. Chapter 8, England and Burgundy in the 15th century. The 15th century would be the 1400s. And what happened in the early 1400s was that English music actually had an impact on what was going on in the continent. So if I say continent, you know, I hope you know, I'm talking about continental Europe. So the way Europe is you got the continent, and then you got this little kind of island off to the side that's Great Britain. That's England, Ireland, Scotland, all that little kind of island. Okay, but when we talk about continental Europe, we're talking about France and Germany and Italy and those, and then the Low Country and those things right there. As a matter of fact, you'll hear Low Country. What is the Low Country? Low Country is how we refer to a set of countries that are referred to as Benelux, which is Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg. Netherlands would be like Holland and Amsterdam, those places. Okay, so Benelux, Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg are the little group of countries that's called the Low Country. Okay, so when you read the book and you're seeing Low Country, that's what it's talking about, if you had that question. Continental is continental Europe. Britain, of course, is across the English Channel, and it wasn't as, I mean, it was still, people still went there. I mean, England and France warred against each other for centuries, so they didn't have any trouble figuring out how to get to each other's shores. But there is something going on there with the English, and it's you're going to see it as it's countenance anglois, but you'll see it countenance anglois, Angloise. Some people say anglois. Anglois would be the French, and that's the countenance anglois refers to an English style or an English quality, and we'll talk more about that as we get into this. So that's one of the things that are going on in England. Now, Burgundy is a territory that's a part of, now it's France, but at the time it would have been part of the French, let's say French state, but it was independent of France. So Burgundy was this chunk of land that, I mean, Burgundy's still there in a certain sense, but it's not independent of France. But at the time, Burgundy would have been considered, for all intents and purposes, independent of France while being stuck in kind of the heart of it. So when we're talking about Burgundy or Burgundian, you'll hear that word. That's what we're talking about. Again, France is this major power, and there's this shifting that occurs throughout the time frames that we're looking at, where France rises as being a world power. At this time, shortly after this, Spain becomes, got Isabel and Ferdinand. She's sending Columbus over to the United States. Well, not to the United States, but to the Americas, North and South America. He doesn't really set foot in the United States, but Columbus is sent out there to explore, try to get this route to China. And so Spain becomes the world power at one point here. And so it's like these countries keep taking turns one-upping each other. And depending on who's in power, who the great powers are, that's kind of where the activity happens. Because if you're a composer, you want to go work where the money and the power is, because that's where the best bucks are. So that's where the movers and shakers are. So that's why people move to New York. They're born in Ohio, or they're born out on a farm in Nebraska, and they want to make it big, so they move to New York or they move to Los Angeles. That's the power centers in the United States. I mean, amongst others, but those would be the big ones, especially New York. Okay, so the three great composers of the time. So when we're talking Burgundy, we're talking basically this group of fiefdoms, kingdoms in France. And we're talking about, when we talk about England, we're talking about England. And since there was this big impact of the English style on music at the time, it's not a surprise that the three composers we're going to focus on in Chapter 8, Guillaume Dufay, who's French, Binchois, who's French, and John Dunstable, who's English. So those are the three guys we want to talk about. And as we get into this, and I'm not going to go over everything in your book, you can read the book. But let's talk about English music first. The English, first of all, there's, like I say, England and France had this, they kept beating up on each other. And the way countries worked back then, within countries and from country to country, if you were in England and you had a realm, let's say that you were down here in this city, okay, and you had another city up here. Now, as we're in kind of medieval, let's say 800, 900, 1000 AD, there was, let's say, time of King Arthur and those guys, okay, so all that Arthurian stuff. If you had, like, Alfred the Great is down here, and he's running whatever city is his, that's his kingdom, and he's not sharing that with anybody. And there's no king over Alfred. He's not king over England. He's king over the town and the territories where he is. In this case, I think he was Wessex. So he was king of Wessex. So Wessex was a place in continental England, and Alfred had total control over it and answered to no one. Then you had somebody up here, maybe at, I don't know, whatever, I can't remember, another kingdom within England, and this guy was whoever it was, okay? And so over time, actually in this case, it was Alfred the Great. Alfred wants to unify England. Now, this is not in your book, I'm just telling you what happened. He wanted to unify England, so he has this daughter marry this guy's son at this kingdom, and he has this daughter, or this son, married that guy's daughter from that kingdom. And over the course of 3 or 4 or 5 generations, more and more kingdoms come under the control of the heirs of certain kings. And what happens then is that it's basically 1 or 2 families, and then one family that's controlling all of this territory. That's how you finally end up with the King of England. And that's how you have Charlemagne, in France, Charles the Great. You have these major uber kings that are taking these little singular kingdoms and bringing them all under one big rule. So that's how you get France is a big kingdom, and England is its own kingdom or its own country. So at the time, the English kings and the French kings are warring. They've married off people to each other. So this king in England will marry off a daughter over to somebody, and this little duchy over here or this little, a duchy is like where a duke runs his little realm, his little kingdom, but his little kingdom happens to be in France. And so you might have, before there's an actual French king over the whole country, there's this little duchy over here, and this English guy sends his daughter over to marry this French prince. And then when this French prince dies, this kingdom claims that as English territory, but it's over in France. Okay, well, that makes everybody mad. So, because the English want their hard won, they bought it by marriage, and they want that territory, and the French say, no, it's on French soil, we're not going to let you have it. So they beat up each other up. This goes on. So the big war is the 100 Years' War, and it starts in 1337, where England says, hey, there's a chunk of France that actually belongs to us through marriage. We're going to take it, okay? And the French say, no, you aren't. Okay? So they beat up on each other. Well, in the meantime, the English kings are actually, and when I say kings, I mean succession of kings. It's 100 years, so it goes through several kings. So over the course of 100 years, through several kings, they set up kingdoms on French soil in some of these territories that they lay claim to. And when they do that, they bring their composers with them to those territories. So now the English composers are in the English claimed area in France, and as far as the English composers figure, they're just over there having a vacation. They're writing their music. They're friends with the French, whatever. As it's not like the French people hated the English people. They were marrying back and forth and doing all that stuff. But it was the kings that were mad at each other, and people went, well, let the kings fight. So the French loved English music. And so the English had figured out how to add thirds and sixths in the chord. Remember, at this point, we're getting these open fifths and open octaves, and it's very stark sounding. Middle English music or early medieval music is monophony. It's single line. When we get to Leonin and Periton and organum and all that stuff, they start writing these open fifths and open octaves. And when we get into the polyphony, and the polyphony that grows over that, let's say 1150 to about 1300, during that time, polyphony grows, but there's a lot of open chords. There's a lot of open fifths and open octaves. There's no thirds and sixths in those, what we would call first inversion chords. None of that stuff is in there except in passing as a dissonance. So when it's used, it's not used as harmonic material. It's used just to get from this note to that note. Well, but the English figure out that if they put a third in an open fifth, it sweetens the chord if they get it in the right intonation. And so the English start to add that, and they start to add sixths. Well, a sixth, if you have a third and a fifth, and or a third and a sixth, you start to hear first inversion chords too. Now we hear it readily because our ears are tuned to hear those kinds of harmonic progressions. But at the time they weren't. So when you added that third or added that sixth into the chord, it made a really sweet, cool sounding, the openness of the chord goes away, and all of a sudden you got this really nice thing going on. And the French love that. The French have always been into timbre and texture. That's what drives French music. And so they hear this, and it's a lot of consonants and a lot less dissonance. So instead of hitting thirds and sixths on the way to get from this note to that note and treat it as a dissonance, they're actually building chords with thirds and sixths and treating them as consonants. That's English. When we talk about Anglois, that's what we're talking about, English countenance, countenance Anglois, English style. Okay, so and as they start to stack chords, naturally homophony emerges. Make sure that you understand the difference between monophony, homophony, and polyphony. Monophony is single line, might be embellished, but it's a single line. Polyphony are two or more independent lines that are formed together, but they're equal in what's going on. They're just separate. Homophony is generally a line, usually on the top. Now it's almost always in the soprano, a melody with chords is what we would call it. So homophony is stacks of notes, chord stacks of notes, and the underlying notes are there to support the single line on top. So homophony is an important line with harmony underneath. So those are the differences. And so now this English style is bringing out this homophonic texture, which up to this point had not existed in this music. It was probably out there in folk songs and stuff like that, but it had not existed in this music. Ultimately, what happens is the French win against the English, and they kick the English out in 1453. 1453. So the 100 Years' War lasts a little longer than 100 years. But the English are finally kicked out. France is France. But the music that the English leaves behind sticks. And it's distributed not just in France, but around the continent. Again, the continent being continental Europe. And so you see this English style seep in over all these other countries. And it lives in next to what's called the continental style. And the continental style is an amalgamation of everything that's not English that's going on in the continent, and which would be like polyphony, church music, stuff that an extension of the stuff that had happened previously. We'll talk more about that. So let's see, polyphony. What else? What else do I want to share with you on this? The English were writing polyphony on Latin texts. There's a difference between polyphony and homophony. So when I say polyphony, I'm talking about independent lines of music crafted to fit with each other. Okay, that's polyphony, in 2 or more independent lines. Homophony is one important melody line with a chordal foundation underneath. Okay, so the largest group of English pieces with polyphony is sacred music with Latin texts, and that's, you know, it's whenever you hear Renaissance sacred music, Latin texts, think masses and probably motets. Okay, motets can be in other languages, but generally at this time, sacred music. Sacred music is still in Latin. Okay, till we get to the Reformation, sacred music is in Latin, and this is the end of the 1400s, beginning of the 1500s, and so the Reformation hasn't started yet. Primary source of early English polyphony, that is the sort. How do we know about English polyphony? Because there is a collection in a manuscript called the Old Hall Manuscript. So Old Hall Manuscript is essentially everything we know about English polyphony. That's what we have. There's something called something else, some things you need to know about this music. Fa burden is similar to something called faux-bourdon, Fauxbourdon, which is a French term, faux-bourdon. And that's what's going on in continental music. The English have their own version of it called fa burden. Faux-bourdon is a stack of one chords planing up and down in parallel motion. That's faux-bourdon. Fa burden is it was improvised over polyphony, so that you would have plain chant, and there'd be a fourth above and a parallel third below. And what we hear now is a first inversion chord, and it worked. It had a similar kind of impact as faux-bourdon. So when you see fa burden, F-A-B-U-R-D-E-N, and F-A-U-X-B-O-U-R-D-O-N, they're not exactly the same thing, but they're definitely first cousins, and they even sound alike. So fa burden in England, faux-bourdon on the continent. Okay, remember the French are dominating power on the continent at this point. Another very English genre is the carol, and a carol in England is the beginning of what we think of as carol. It's 2 or 3 part setting of a poem. It can be in English, it can be in Latin, It uses that same consonance anglois, which are the parallel thirds and sixths, and it's almost always religious subjects, usually Christmas songs, Christmas carols, Christmas songs, or songs about the Virgin Mary. So, but some of those have actually come down to us from this time. So we think carol, we think Christmas carol. Well, the Christmas carol is a direct descendant of the English carol of this time. It had, there were a number of stanzas. It's the same music over and over with different stanzas for each verse. And it had a refrain, fa la 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 la, or some kind of refrain. The refrain would start, the refrain was called a burden, B-U-R-D-E-N. And they'd start with that refrain, then they'd sing a verse, then they'd sing the refrain, and they'd sing a verse, and they'd sing a refrain. There's an example of that, Alleluia, from a new work, is in your listening. Major composers, number one composer, greatest English composer of the first half of the 15th century, at 1400 to 1450 period, is John Dunstable. John Dunstable wrote in all the main types of polyphonic compositions. He wrote isorhythmic motets, mass ordinary settings. Remember, they set the mass ordinary. The mass proper was a different animal. Mass ordinary is the stuff, the Kyrie, the Gloria, those 5 parts that we've talked about in the past. That's what he was setting. He did do settings of chant, free liturgical texts, which they weren't motets, they weren't masses, but just songs or carols set in he wrote those in secular songs. And there's an example of that. Quam pulchra es is down in your listening. All right. At this point, the definition of motet expands in the 15th century. Listen to what I'm about to say. You will appreciate it as you're taking the exam. The definition of motet expands in the 15th century. In the 13th century, it starts out as added text to a discant clausula. The term grows to encompass compositions with texted upper voices above a cantus firmus. The isorhythmic motet disappears by 1450. Everything you need to know about the change of style, the definition of a motet, is in my book. It's on page 175. Okay, in my book, page 175, there is this nifty chart. You see that? I'm going to hold it right there. So if you don't have my version of the book and you can't find it, you can freeze this and you can get the information off that chart. This page, 175 in my book, redefining the motet, chart on the motet. This shows the 5 distinct variations that the definition motet goes through. It starts in the early 1200s when motets arise. Remember, motet doesn't go back to 800 or 700 or 600. Motet is a polyphonic piece. So to be a polyphonic piece, it's got to be happening when polyphony is on the rise. And polyphony is on the rise late 1100s into the early 1200s. That's when motets come into being. So we've got early 1200s, then we have 1200s to 1300s, then we have 1310 to 1450, which was when the isorhythmic motets were, and then 1400s on, and then mid 1500s on. Everything you need to know about shifting motets is right there. So I just made your life much easier. I hope you actually watch this part of the tape, and you'll see soon why that is. So redefining the motet. I won't go into any more of that. English influence. The English practice of fa burden makes a large impact on music across the continent and also in other types of music in England. So if you're sitting there in England, you're hearing this stuff, it's impacting other music. And what happens, ultimately, what happens from fa burden and this English countenance or English style quality, what happens is that there is an acceptance of homophony, an acceptance of homorhythmic textures. Homorhythmic texture. If what is a homorhythmic texture versus a polyrhythmic texture? Polyrhythmic texture is different voices doing different polyrhythmic texture are different rhythms going on at the same time in different voices. Homorhythmic or homorhythmic texture is all the voices have the same rhythm, the same underlying rhythm. That's music today. Most music that you listen to is homorhythmic or homorhythmic, depending on how you want to pronounce it. Okay, so that's what you need to know about that. Okay, we talked about, let's see how we're doing. Music in the Burgundian lands. Burgundy. Burgundy was a duchy. What is a duchy? A duchy is D-U-C-H-Y. A duchy is a kingdom ruled by a duke. Okay, so if you are lucky enough to be born to the king or queen, that makes you a prince or a princess. So you know that from the Disney movies. Okay, so the descending power chain goes like this. There's kings and queens. There's prince and princesses. And then there's dukes and duchess. A duke or a duchess, let's say duke, a duke-run kingdom is a real kingdom. And they probably wouldn't, well, they wouldn't have called him king whatever, they'd call him duke whatever, but he was the guy in charge. And so he ran the kingdom, but it wasn't called a kingdom, it's called a duchy. And he ran his duchy as a king would run a kingdom. So a kingdom is run by kings. And a duchy is run by dukes. But that is what Burgundy was. So Burgundy was this, it's a major power with a major court. Burgundy is so major of a power that it was, well, we'll talk about it. I mean, basically, he's almost on a par with the king of France at that time. There was a king of France, and he was almost on a par with him in terms of power. So, and this Burgundy is this huge, powerful court with huge, they're hiring top-notch musicians, and it becomes a place for, it's key to the international style that develops at this time. So Duke of Burgundy was a feudal vassal of the King of France. Feudal vassal means that the Duke had pledged his military support to the King of France, because if you're the King of France and you have no military, you're not going to be the king for very long. So the Duke of Burgundy said, I pledge my troops, my men, to your defense. And that made him a feudal vassal of the king. Now, the Duke is very powerful. Like I say, he's almost on an equal par with the king. And at the time, the Burgundian dukes, and there's a series of them, the Burgundian dukes take advantage of the king after the end of the 100 Years' War. So in 1453, the French boot the English out, but the French have spent a lot of time, resources, and manpower on defending France. Burgundy, on the other hand, has been getting fat, dumb, and happy, staying out of the conflict. So at the time of the end of the 100 Years' War, Burgundy is very, very powerful. And when I say powerful, it means that they had a bunch of men, a bunch of troops, and they had lots of money, and people were doing very well in Burgundy. And you had France, which was on the ropes because they had spent a lot of their resources to defend their country. At one point, the English, the Burgundy turns the screws on France and says, we're going to extract some advantages from our power, from our relationship with France. And so Burgundy, in an effort to get the French to kind of capitulate and say, okay, yeah, well, what do you want us to do, Burgundy? We're we're more than happy to, we want to be your friends. We appreciate you're a vassal. And what can we do to make you happy? Well, at one point, the Burgundian king contacts the English and says, I want to set up an alliance with you. Now, the reason he does that is so he can make the French king squirm. And it's effective, because by the time all of this is done, Burgundy ends up with what's now Holland, Belgium, a part of northern France, Luxembourg. All these things, which were independent countries, now all come under Burgundian control. So at this point, Burgundy is even more powerful than France. And so the capital was Dijon. Yep, same place where you get the mustard. So Burgundy, the Burgundian court becomes the place in continental Europe. That's where the best known, the people are well connected, the wealthy, the well-financed, the smartest, the best composers. Burgundy had the best of everything. Now, it wasn't forever. It was for a shorter period of time, but it's enough that it makes Burgundy the main player on the continent, and they end up impacting the music centers that are in Rome and Germany and Paris and England and Italy. That all comes from Burgundy. So there's a continental and international style that comes out. And so most of the leading composers by the late 15th century are Burgundians. Now, today we would say France. They had French names. They spoke the French language. They looked French. They acted French. We call them Burgundians because at this time they weren't in France. They were in Burgundy. Okay, so those are two different places at the time. And by 1477, though, the Duke dies, and Burgundy becomes, because in all of this chicanery and finagling, and they picked up Holland and they picked up Belgium and all that, Burgundian gets very powerful. But in the process, the French and the Burgundians enter into and I think it was through marriage ultimately that did it. It is actually through the Duke dies, and then his heirs happen to be French through marriage, and Burgundy becomes French, becomes part of France. And that's 1477. So Burgundy is very powerful up to 1477. Burgundy is very powerful after 1477, but it's no longer its own country. It's now part of France. So this cosmopolitan style, courts had lots of foreign visitors. It was a place to travel. It was a place to go vacation. And they were members of the court were constantly, the people that worked for the court were constantly changing jobs with other courts. The artists and the painters and the musicians and the guy that ran the parties. I mean, people were changing. So there's this big cross-pollination. And Burgundy and then there's all this international trade that's going on. And Burgundy physically was kind of in the middle of all of this, and power-wise, they're in the middle of all of it. So that's why Burgundy is so important at this time. Genre and texture to this international style. There's four principal types of polyphonic compositions. There's secular chanson, and that had French texts, is Burgundy. There were motets, Magnificat. Magnificat is Mary saying, "My soul magnifies the Lord." It's the setting of that. We talked about that in the past. And then there was the Mass ordinary. Remember, two big parts of the Mass. The offices are a different part of the liturgy. There's the offices in the Catholic Church, and then there's the Mass in the Catholic Church. And the Mass in the Catholic Church has the ordinary and the proper. Okay? And we've talked about that. They're writing for the ordinary, not the proper. Now they are writing for the proper, but this is the stuff that's going on in the ordinary. Okay? Remember to keep those two separate. They're two different sets of music. Bechua and the Burgundian chanson. Okay, so let's talk about chanson a little bit. Bechua lives in the early 1400s, early 15th century. He worked in the Burgundian court for Philip the Good, who's the Duke of Burgundy. He wrote a ton of songs. French chanson. That's songs. That's all it means. French songs. French songs are in French, and they were polyphonic settings of French poems, and usually about love. I mean, maybe 70 to 80% of the time, the songs were about love, just like pop songs are today. They're generally about love. Not all of them, but most of them. Okay, the good and the bad. So that's what these songs were about. They followed. Remember, we talked about forme fixe. Know about forme fixe? Forme fixe. They followed the form of a rondeau. Rondeau is a specific form. You can look it up in the book, and it tells you the A, B, B, A, you know, whatever. However, the form goes. But it was the chansons were usually rondeaus. Guillaume de Fille looks like William. It's William. It's, the American, the English the English version is William Guillaume. So Guillaume de Fille, again, early to mid 15th century, is the most famous composer of the time. So we talked about these other guys. Dufay is the main guy of this time. So he travels all over the place. He's into this cross-pollination. He's helping this cross-pollination of styles. In his music, Dufay is a representative, D-U-F-A-Y, Dufay. His music is a representative of the international style. So Dunstable over there on the continents anglois, and Dufay on international style. His chansons are international, and I've got a couple chansons down there in your listening. And then he also wrote motets and chants, and I've got a couple of those. He's got one of his isorhythmic motets is in your listening also. The polyphonic mass, let's see. Polyphonic mass, before the 15th century, when the ordinary of the mass was performed, it was usually a compilation of different composers' works. Okay, so we said, let's see, what did I say? Proper, okay, the ordinary of the mass is the one with the Kyrie, Gloria, and all that. If I said something different, I may have said something different back then. Okay, I don't want to confuse you. Mass ordinary, mass proper. Mass ordinary is the part that the composer set. Mass proper is the stuff somebody could or could not set. But mass ordinary is the stuff the composer set. And now you're going, oh no, he's got me all confused now. Okay, mass ordinary, that's what you're thinking. Usually, in the mass ordinary, the parts that were set, there are multiple parts to the ordinary. The parts that were set were the Kyrie, the Gloria, the Credo, the Sanctus, and the Agnus Dei. Those 5 movements. So when a composer sets the mass, that's what they're setting. When we talk about mass, we're talking about the ordinary, and we're talking about those 5 movements. Okay, so up to before the 15th century, before the 1400s, when churches did a mass setting, they would take a Gloria from this guy, and they'd take a Credo from this composer over here, and they might use a Kyrie by Michaud over here, and then they might use from a different setting later on for the Agnus Dei. Okay, so they took from all different places. By the 15th century, the composers, now there's the exception to that is Michaud, the Michaud Mass from the mid-1300s. That was all Michaud, one mass setting with those 5 movements. That's an exception. Usually didn't go that way. Usually a composer sat down and wrote one of those, or if he wrote, usually they wrote one of those 5 movements. Let's call them movements or sections. But when we get to the 15th century, composers are now conceiving of mass as a big composition. So they're looking at mass as the form, and they're looking at the texts within that, the 5 sections of the mass that they generally set to music. They're composing those as a unified whole. So they're thinking of it, how do I take elements of this section and bring it into this section and bring it into this section? So that's what's going on. So so there are musical links in the mass cycles now. So when you hear the term mass cycle, composers are linking the sections together through musical elements. The text is the text. That doesn't change. A Kyrie has the same text in all mass settings. A Credo has the same text in all settings. Those are the texts that are set. But now composers have figured out that they can take motivic material, musical material, and put it in all 5 sections, and it gives a sense of unity to the composition. So that's when this happens. That's a kind of a major thing, because it's how we start to conceive of large works that still have a sense of unity tied together as a coherent whole. So so think in terms of stylistic coherence, all 5 sections in the same style of music. A plain song mass is music that's based on the same chant, on the same Gregorian chant. Okay. A motto mass is M-O-T-T-O, is the same thematic material in all movements. A cantus firmus mass is a mass that has the same cantus firmus in each movement. And so it has the same head motive. The beginning motive is the same in each movement. And by the second half of the 15th century, cantus firmus mass becomes the standard. Everybody's now writing cantus firmus masses second half of the 15th century. So I'll let you read through some of that in your book, because I don't have time to cover all of this. Let's see if there's anything else I want to tell you about this. Cantus firmus imitation mass. A cantus firmus imitation mass. It's when they use the tenor of a polyphonic chanson. Remember, chanson is a French song. So they borrow a polyphonic chanson tenor. So they're writing, and the tenor is that bottom line at the time. They take that line, and they're going to use that as a cantus firmus. And they also take information from the upper voices. So a cantus firmus imitation mass is when they're taking musical material from all the voices, not just the tenor, the cantus firmus. They take it from all voices. So an imitation mass based on a French chanson. So think of the French chanson as a secular pop song. Think of the mass as a sacred liturgy, service music, okay? And they started to write service music based on pop French songs. That's what was going on. So they would, now it wasn't so blatant that they took a Katy Perry song and stuck religious words with it, but they took parts of the Katy Perry song and they, you know, so here's Katy Perry singing whatever, and they take parts. Is she still big? People still listen to Katy Perry? Okay, if you know who I'm talking about, I think you do. They take parts, little motives and sections of the song. They lift that out and actually put it into the mass setting, and that's what that's called. So now, one of the tunes that they loved to mess with was something called L'Homme Armé. L'Homme Armé is the armed man. And the armed man is armed man had been used for centuries. Armed man had been around forever, just this monophonic song. And so, and I've got it posted in your listening. L'Homme Armé, yara tam parati ta 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 ta. I even remember the tune. I don't remember all the French, but it's a major tune that composers then start to set to masses. And it just like everybody sets Lomar May to one of their masses. So it was the in thing to do to take the tune from Lomar May and build a mass out of it. Dufay does it, Ockingham does it, Josquin does it, Palestrina, the #1 composer of the Renaissance, does a Lomar May mass. Everybody does it. It's what you do. It's like the ice bucket challenge or the cinnamon challenge, or I'm going to get on YouTube and I'm going to do this crazy thing. Well, everybody does it because they're trying to outdo each other. So Lomar May is important. So, so that you know, if that ends up on a test sometime, you know what it is. Guillaume Dufay, Missa Lomar May, the Kyrie in your listening. So not only is the tune Lomar May in your listening, but also the Kyrie from Dufay's Missa Lomar May, the mass armed man is what it, Missa Lomar May, that's what it means, literally. So you'll get to hear the tune, then you get to hear how Dufay stitches that tune into the mass setting. Cantus Firmus masses were 3 voice compositions. And because there were 3 voice compositions, a problem starts occurring when they put the Cantus Firmus as the tenor. So remember, Cantus Firmus is a tune that they borrowed from some other source. Originally, it starts out as a plain chant. They take a Gregorian chant, which is running stepwise. But we talked about Lomar May, and that thing goes dun 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 ba-da-dum ba-da-da da dun 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 ba-da-da-da-da-dum ba-da-da-da-da-dum ba-da-da-da-da-dum. Well, imagine using that as your bottom line, and you got to build chords off that. It's crazy. Even though they expand it, and it's ba 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 ba, which is what they did with the Cantus Firmus. They took the tune, stretched it way out in time, and then built all the voices above it. So the thing that made that challenging was the tune wasn't particularly ripe for using as what ended up being a foundation for the whole piece. So what happened was, and here it is, if you're wondering where bass lines started, this is where it started. They said, well, that doesn't really work as a great place to build a harmonic. It doesn't work as a harmonic foundation. So composers scratched their heads and said, what can we do? Well, they said, well, let's go ahead and put that in the tenor voice, but we need some more notes so that we have a solid foundation for the harmonies that we're building, because now they're stacking chords. And they come up with something called a contratenor below, contratenor bass. Now, bass being bass, like I build a house, and this is the base or the foundation, okay? Bassus, bassus. That's where we get bass. That's what it means. We say bass, which is French, or which is Italian. Bass is Italian, comes from bassus, the Latin. It means bass. But we don't say B-A-S-E, we say B-A-S-S. It means the same thing, bass, okay? So they come up with something called a contratenor, below the tenor, bass. Then they started to call it bassus. And so we come up with superius, altus, tenor, bassus. And that's the beginning of 4-voice writing. That has stuck, and we still use it, okay? So that's the beginning of bass lines. Now, bass lines, as we know it, really came about around 1600 when homophony, and we'll talk about that when we get to it. But this is it. This is the end of, it's the second half of the 15th century. So it's right at the beginning, just before and right at the beginning of the 1500s is where this starts to come in. And it leads then to what we think of as bass lines as of 1600. So that's where it all happens. Okay, so what do we get from all of this? Let's see. How are we doing? Hour and 15 minutes at this point. I'm going to do this without a break, I hope. So what comes out of this time is this enduring musical language. This is the earliest music, okay? if you walked into the class and you heard, Epitaph of Sikolos, you go, oh man, that is really crazy music. Kind of it's kind of creepy. Matter of fact, some of you have actually used the word creepy in describing some of the music that you listen to. Okay, the music is weird sounding because they aren't using the kind of sweetness that comes from stacked tertian harmony. We're into these, 3 chords built on thirds, right? That's our sense of musical harmony. That's what our ears are tuned to hear. This time, right here, is where music starts to sound like music that we can access, that we don't have to go, well, this is written a long time ago and it's really strange, but I guess, I can deal with that. But this is where music actually starts to sound like music that we recognize. Now, it's not quite the music we do now, but it's very, very close. And to an untrained ear, when I do music appreciation, it's right here, this music, where people come up and they'll start to say, hey, Dr. Stolberg, I really like that piece by Palestrina, or I really like that piece by Dufay. It was really, I can get into that. I can understand that. Yeah, I know. I understand why they're saying that. It's because now we're getting stacked chords, we're getting homophony, we're getting tertian harmonies, even though they aren't really built to be tertian harmonies yet. They're hearing the same stuff we're hearing. The composers of the time are hearing the same stuff we're hearing. And so much of this is kind of thirds in the middle of the chord, thirds in a chord, or sixths in a chord, which are one first inversion chords. That use the four-part writing, bass, tenor, alto, soprano, and then the fact that the voices have a kind of an equal job to do within those harmonies. All of that comes out of the international style, all of that comes out of the English style. That is pretty much what takes us through the 19th century. And even today, a pop song's written with that same kind of sensibility. But music all the way through the Romantic period is written with these kinds of ideals now. So lots of music, lots of cool music to listen to. We're going on chapter 9, Franco-Flemish composers. So if I say Franco is France. Flemish is basically that Flemish would be like Burgundy in those areas. So you think Franco-Flemish, think France, okay? So Franco-Flemish composers, 1450 to 1520. There's a lot of political change and consolidation. We've already talked about this. Some of this late 15th and early 16th centuries. The composers are relying on patron. Remember, God to monarchs to men. This is a time of monarchs, and composers worked for monarchs. If you wanted to make a living as a composer, you had to get a job in a court someplace. And we've talked about right around 1500, there's this political shifting going on. Burgundy is now under French rule. France consolidates now. They've recovered from the war. Remember, the war ends the middle of 1400s. And now here we are around 1500, 50 years later. France takes back Burgundy, or takes in Burgundy, absorbs Burgundy. And France becomes very strong power-wise, politically. Spain is consolidating into a country, and Spain is growing in power. Spain sponsors a guy named Cristobal Colombo, right? Sponsors Christopher Columbus. We call him Christopher Columbus. It would have been, he's Italian, so it's Cristobal Colombo. Or Cristobal Colombo would be Spanish, and Cologne would be the French. His name is pronounced, whatever country you live in, that's how they pronounce his name. So Christopher Columbus takes a trip out west to the Americas. And when I say the Americas, I'm not talking about the United States. I'm talking about North and South America is where he's headed. So when I say Americas, America is more than the United States. We say America, but America takes in South America, Central America, North America, including Canada. So that's all Americas, the Americas. So we talk about the Americas, that's what we're talking about. Because America, that we know, does not exist at this point, other than as part of the North American continent and a place where Native American Indians live. So, let's see what else happens. There's unification of Austria, Spain, parts of Italy. All of that comes under the Habsburg rulers. I'll leave that up to your civics class, your Western Civs class. Germany and Italy are still fragmented. Germany has these lots of little powerful regions, all independent of each other. Italy actually has city-states. So Milan is its own kingdom, and Rome is its own kingdom, and all of these they're real powerful little places, but they're all their own fiefdoms. Okay, so that's going on. We talked about England getting kicked out of France. Let's see. Okay, let's talk about the most important composers of this time are Ockeghem and Benoit. Benoit, it looks like bus noise, B-U-S-N-O-Y-S. You'll actually hear some folks say bus noise, but it's Benoit. Okay, that's French. So those are the most important composers in this generation after Dufay. Okay, Dufay is top of the heap this time. They're writing chanson. They use forme fixe. There's a Benoit example, the Virelet, a forme fixe, right? Virelet is one of the 3 forme fixes. Make sure you know forme fixe. Benoit and Ockeghem chanson were very popular at the time. They're writing masses. They use cantus firmus. Ockeghem shows really extensive creativity, amazing. He writes a mass, the Massa Quis Vis Toni, the Missa Quis Vis Toni, which is a mass in any mode. So he writes the mass so that it'll work. Remember, we talked about church modes. It'll work in mode 1, 3, 5, and 7. So you can take and put whatever mode you want to, whatever key you want to put the mass in, and it works in all different church modes. Very cool. Then he writes something called the Missa Prolationum, and that's it's notated in 2 voices, but it's sung in 4 voices. So what he does is he puts 2 voices, and then he puts the voices. Each voice is in 2 different keys and lengths. So he uses different meters and different keys. So we'll have this voice is in the key of A in 2/4, and then also sing it in the key of E in 6/8. And then he looks at the other voice and he says, this voice is in the key of G in 3/4, and it's in the key of E, or key of D, in 4/4. Okay, and so he writes 2 voices and puts them in 4 different rhythmic modes, basically, and keys, and then you do them at the same time, and it actually works. It's amazing. This guy was brilliant. Okay, so Ockeghem is very important, and he starts some of these things. He starts using some techniques that Bach then takes in the Baroque period and runs with. And we'll talk about that when we get to Bach, but we're going to introduce him here. So 2 or more voices from a single notated voice is called a canon. We call them rounds. Row, row, row your boat gently down the stream. Row, row, row your boat gently down the stream. That's a canon, okay? So he writes in canon. He writes in inversion. And an inversion works by moving the same intervals in the opposite direction. So if you have a line that goes It starts on the starting pitch. It goes up a major third, down a perfect fourth, up a minor second, up a perfect fifth. And so the inversion of that is starting pitch, down a major third, up a perfect fourth, down a minor, whatever that was. He takes the intervals from the first pitch and puts them. They're the same intervals, but they're in opposite directions of the way you used it the first time. And he writes inversions where you have the original tune against the tune that's been inverted. And then he writes a retrograde. That's where you have the original tune, and then you play the tune backwards. So it's like a mirror image. So you've got the tune, then you start at this point at the end of the tune, and you play it backwards, and then they fit together. Okay, Bach did that. Again, the people who do this stuff are brilliant. So Ockeghem starts it, and then Bach runs with it later on. And then let's see, we talked about retrograde. Mensuration canon is mensuration being measured. Mensuration canon, the voices move at different rates of speed by using different mensuration signs. So if you go back to chapter 6, you got the half circle and the whole circle and circle with the dot, and okay, the half circle with the dot, where we get common time and cut time. Well, each one of those is like triple meter, duple divided, triple meter, triple divide, duple meter, duple divided, duple meter, triple divide. Okay, so each of those are different ways of what we would call meter signatures. And he would take a mensuration canon, takes those meters and writes a line that's sung different meters. Okay, so that's a mensuration canon. Crazy this is crazy complex stuff, and it sounds great. And then a canon. We talked a little bit about a canon. It's like a round. It would allow a composer to display all of these things. Allowed a composer to display brilliance. The idea wasn't to let people hear. When Ockeghem wrote this stuff, and then later on when Bach uses these same techniques, when you listen to the piece, you don't know what's going on. You don't hear it as being, oh, that's the same tune backwards. You wouldn't hear it that way, but that's exactly what it is. It's not until you take the manuscript and study it and you start to pick it out that you go, wow, this is crazy complex. And I can see that the guy was intentional in doing these patterns, and you realize how much brilliance goes into the piece. So the idea was to write stuff that was brilliant, but not let anybody know you were doing it. That's pretty cool. So let's see, medieval and newer features, medieval and Renaissance features that they're using. Both Ockeghem and Benoit. Benoit was using forme fixe, which is a medieval device. Structural tenors, cantus firmus tenors. That's newer stuff that's going on, but it comes from medieval techniques. So cantus firmus goes all the way back to medieval times, right? When we first start to, that's on your listening stuff. Matter of fact, check your listening lists, because I've added a term or two to some previous chapters. So don't think that those are static. So if I see something, oh, I should have put that in there, I'll go back, and I've updated all of that. It's all updated. Imitation is one of the newer things. Equality of voices. Okay, so each voice, again, that's polyphony, but each voice is independent and has its own equal position in the composition. And then greater range. They're now writing with greater range. They put the bass down here, and all of the voices are now singing greater ranges. So instead of just locked into a fifth or a sixth, they're now exploring octaves and wider ranges. Let's see, we've talked. Okay, we've talked about these guys. Ockeghem, Benoit, Dufay. They're all born and trained in the Low Countries. So that's the Benelux, Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg, Low Countries. They traveled all over. They worked in numerous courts. They worked in numerous churches throughout Europe. Their music was, they were using formal structure instead of just kind of what sounds good. They were actually using formal structure, very intricate polyphony, melismatic melodies, homophonic texture, and rhythmic variety, including dance-like rhythms. Okay, so that's all the stuff that's going on. Oh, that's into Josquin. I'm sorry. Let's bring these guys in. How much time do we have? Okay, I'll mention these guys. They're important. Three composers are picking up on these style things, all the stuff that I just mentioned. Obrecht, Jacob Obrecht, Isaac, and Josquin. But I'm going to concentrate. I'll let you read about Obrecht and Isaac on your own. I don't think I have any examples of their music, but I do have examples of Josquin. 1450 to 1521. Josquin. He's the finest composer of the first half of the Renaissance. So if you think of Palestrina, the second half of the Renaissance, Josquin, the first half of the Renaissance, they're the bookends for what's going on. He held prestigious positions. Again, Benelux. He comes from the Benelux countries. Petrucci is the guy that's publishing manuscripts. He's publishing stuff all the time, and he's publishing lots of publishers. No publisher gets more than, let's say, one volume of works published, because he's out publishing a bunch of guys. Josquin is so popular, he publishes 3 volumes of his masses, and he had to do reprints because they were in such demand. Josquin says that, or Martin Luther says about Josquin, because Martin Luther Josquin dies in 1521. Martin Luther writes his theses in 1517. So Martin Luther is a contemporary. Martin Luther says Josquin's the master of the notes. They must do as he wills. And then he says everybody else has to do what the notes will. That's what Luther says. It's in your book. It's pretty cool. I think that's in your book. I think the Martin Luther quote's in your book. And some of his music was still being performed a century after his death, which was highly unusual, because people didn't want to bother with old music. Basically, if it was so last year, they were always interested in the new stuff, not interested in the old stuff. But Josquin's music is so fine, it's still being performed 100 years after he was on Earth. He wrote 50 motets, freely composed. He was a master of text depiction and text expression. Text depiction is a musical gesture that reinforces the images in the text. So text depiction would be like Vivaldi in the Vivaldi seasons, where they're doing spring, and he wants to represent birds. He's got little birds twittering in the flutes. He's got flutes actually making twittering sounds. Or if he wants to designate ice, he does slipping with the violin. Or thunder and lightning. He goes, and then that's Vivaldi. But he's doing lightning and thunder with the violins. So that's text depiction, except that there's no text with that. It's all musical. But take that and think, if you're singing through a song and you have text, and it talks about mountains, they would be trying to write, they'd write the notes up, mountains, and if they talked about valleys, they'd write the pitches going down to represent the valleys. It's text depiction. Then there's text expression. Text expression is if the music's sad, you put it in a minor key. Okay, it's where the music is used to convey the emotions of the text. Okay, so that's text expression. An example of text depiction and expression, Ave Maria, Down in Your Listening, by Josquin. Then he writes masses, lots of masses, very creative. Uses secular tunes for the Canis Firmus, does a L'Homme Armé, does really cool things with this music. Not time to get into it, but Josquin's worth studying. He does imitation masses, where he borrows material from all the voices of secular work and applies that material to the mass, not just the Canis Firmus. We've already talked about that. He does paraphrase masses, where he borrows a tune as a Canis Firmus, and then uses that Cantus Firmus and all the voices, parts of it, as part of his motives. And again, that's Ave Maria Virgos Serena, Down in Your Listening. He writes chansons. It's French-speaking, Benelux guy. Chansons, Josquin's contemporaries were writing in that new style. He abandons the form fixe. He uses strophic texts and simple poems, 4 voices, equal voices, imitation, homophony. Mille regrets down there, a million regrets. Let's see, million regrets down the bottom. Mille regrets, and then let's see. Old and new recap. Music of Ockeghem and Benoit weaves old and new music elements. Okay, Ockeghem and Benoit are the last guys to use form fixe. They adopted the new extended range, quality of voices, more imitation, freer treatment of borrowed material. Josquin, in his generation, a new freedom in polyphonic writing, imitation, homophony, and setting of the text. Remains popular into the 16th century. Much of Josquin's generation of musical style remains with us today, and we are the heirs of the Renaissance. Okay, so that is chapter 9. We are the heirs of the Renaissance. Renaissance is the music that we can begin to resonate with. Okay, chapter 10. How am I doing? I am. Let's see. Oh, we went through that pretty quick. Yeah, got an hour. Good. Sacred music in the era of the Reformation. Now we're going to talk about the church. And we're going to talk about, this is chapter 10. We're going to shift gears. God to monarchs to men. There are the courts. There are the churches. There are composers that work exclusively in one of those or the other. And then there are composers that work in both. What's happening in the courts is different than what's happening in the churches. But there's cross-pollination of ideas that occur because people don't live in vacuums. If you were living in a court, you still went to church and heard the church music. So if you were a composer that was writing both court and church music, you would naturally, you would have to imitate styles, right? You can't do a style that you can't, if you're a worship leader at a church, you're not going to do a style that the church is not comfortable with. So there is Christian rap. And the reason there's Christian rap is because there's rap. Christian rap didn't start the genre, rap started the genre, and then rap spilled over, as most genre do, spill over into the Christian side. As Christians hear the rap, they like rap, and so they want to write Christian rap, they write it. Okay, but I work at a church where if I went in and did Christian rap, they wouldn't run me out of town on a rail. They'd wonder, why did I do Christian rap? Because there isn't a desire for that, for rap or for heavy metal, because there's Christian heavy metal, or let's see, is there Christian emo? Yeah, there's probably stuff that comes pretty close to Christian emo. But what they want is Chris Tomlin or the Gettys. And so that's the style of music I do. So it's not that the music isn't being done, it's just what is the church hiring me to do? I'm a paid when I'm at church, I'm a hired gun. I'm paid to do the music that the church wants me to do. I might sneak stuff in there occasionally to try to stretch the church, but generally that's not my job. My job is to take people up the mountain to meet God and to worship. I mean, figuratively speaking. So it's to lead worship. And so as I lead worship, I try to lead worship in a way that people can access the worship. I don't want people to think about the music. Why are we doing this music? I want people to think, I love God. I've come here to worship today. So I'm going to do music that makes sense to the people I'm leading. That's always been the case, and it was happening in churches of the time. In courts, you could be more experimental. Hey, listen to this. I came up with this new way of writing stuff. In courts, you could do that. In churches, you couldn't get away with it. So here is sacred music in the era of the Reformation. The 16th century, 1500s, the 16th century starts out peacefully. Things are going really well. And by the mid-century, the peace is shattered, and there's these religious wars that have started that are going to continue for 100 years. As a matter of fact, some of that religious stuff continues to reverberate today in certain countries. Okay, so what happened? Well, the Reformation begins. Sacred music is going to be changed forever. Congregational singing and the services were switched from Latin to the vernacular. That's one of the big moves. So when we talk about Reformation, we're talking about music, okay? When I ask you a question about the Reformation, I'm asking you about a question about the Reformation as it pertains to music. So it's not a Western Civs class. This is a music history class. So if I ask you about Reformation, you don't have to go into a lot of stuff that doesn't have anything to do with music. Go into the stuff that has to pertain to music. Well, one of the things that pertains to music is that Luther says, hey, we need to let people read the Bible in their own language so they don't have to depend on somebody who speaks Latin to tell them what it actually means. So Luther changes parts, not all, but parts of the service to vernacular. So now the Germans are going to church and they're hearing scripture in German. It's German because Luther does a German translation. So they're doing the scripture in German. And for the first time, people can get a German copy of the scriptures and go home and read it. And so so this happens in other countries too. So you now have translations of the Bible in German, French, Italian, English. All that's happening. All happens over a period of years. Okay, so these are and new types of religious music comes up. So up to this point, it's been masses and motets, and then incidental religious music. Okay, in the Lutheran churches, it's chorales, chorale, chorales. In the Calvinist circles, it's metrical psalms. The Anglicans developed something called the anthem and service. The Catholics continue to use Gregorian chant in polyphonic masses and motets, but they try to change them to make them more accessible to people. Because going into the Reformation, with all the stuff I just told you about, masses and motets, polyphonic writing becomes very, very complex. And so it's a matter of just kind of a tour de force of sound, but you can't even understand the words anymore because there's so many things going on and the words are happening at different times that it's hard to even make out what the text is. So, and then Jewish music is there. It remains distinctive, very Jewish, but it's not immune to influences going around it. So there's some changes in Jewish music too. We won't spend a lot of time with the Jewish music because it's kind of a sidecar over here on the bigger issues. Okay, Reformation. Briefly, we're going to look at the Reformation. It starts with Martin Luther and his disagreements with the Catholic Church. Remember, Martin Luther didn't go in trying to start a new religion or a new denomination. Martin Luther wanted to just reform the church. All he wanted to do was say, look, There's stuff wrong here, and we need to really address it. Well, Martin Luther, we'll talk a little bit about Martin Luther here. But Martin Luther says we need to change some stuff about our doctrine. And it's like the kerosene lantern. It gets tipped over and starts the barn on fire. That's what happens. Lots of people glom onto that idea, and total rebellion ends up against the church. Luther wasn't planning on that happening, at least what we know about him, but that is what happened. So what happens is all this protesting. Protestant is protesting. People who protest. Protestants are people who protest. Okay, that's where we get the word. So the Lutherans are under Luther, following Luther, are Northern Germany and Scandinavia. The Calvinists are Switzerland, the Low Countries, France, and Britain. And then the Church of England would be King Henry VIII. That's England. That's a different animal. We'll talk about that. And then, of course, Southern Germany continues to be Catholic. Okay, they somehow Northern Germany goes Lutheran, and Southern Germany. That means the same thing that happens in Ireland and Northern Ireland. So, or in Northern Ireland proper, where you've got Catholics and Protestants in the same place. All right, Martin Luther, 1483 to 1546. And he's a professor of biblical theology at the University of Wittenberg. That's what Luther was doing at the time. He was a prof. He was teaching kids about the Bible and doctrine. And so he could read the word in Latin, in the translations, in the Latin translation. And because, of course, the Bible wasn't written in Latin. We know that, right? Okay, but he could read the Bible, and he's reading it, and what he's reading isn't following everything that the Pope and that the Catholic Church has accepted as being true. He comes up with, it's amazing how much scripture is in your book. That's unusual. But he comes up with, he looks at Romans 1:17, the just will live by faith. So it's faith, we're saved through faith alone. That's Luther. When he writes the 95 Theses, the stuff he's really concerned about are the letters of indulgences. So these things are really galling him. So among other things, these 95 Theses, which are 95 points of disagreement with the church is what it is. He says the letters of indulgences are just wrong. We shouldn't be doing them. The letter of indulgence was, the church was teaching at this time, because it was a source of income. The Catholic Church was teaching that if you did good works, well, the way it worked and still works in the Catholic Church is you die and you go to purgatory. If you're really bad, you go to hell. If you die and you're basically good, but you did some bad stuff, you go to purgatory. And in purgatory, you stay there until you've suffered enough to pay the penalty of the bad things you did, and then you go to heaven. Okay, so it goes hell if you're really bad, purgatory if you're good, but you did bad things, and then straight to heaven. A ticket straight to heaven is for the saintly people, the people that they end up sainting. So, Saint Teresa or Saint Benedict or Saint Patrick, right? Getting all the snakes out of Ireland. So those guys go straight to heaven. Mary would have gone straight to heaven. So the way it works is that if you're here on earth and you do a good work, you do a good deed, that is a good thing that gets you into heaven, because the Catholics teach that that it's faith and works that get you to heaven. Well, that works part is what galled Luther. And so he says, we got to get rid of these, because what was happening is that people could, you could sell letters of indulgences. So the priests would say, the priest might say, I've done 25 Hail Marys today, and I can sell you those Hail Marys to apply them to your account of your dead husband to get him out of purgatory more quickly. And so if you're the wife and you've got an extra couple bucks and you give that to the priest, and you can buy a letter of indulgence that says, I'm paying for the right to use the good works that this priest did and put them towards the account of my husband who's already dead in purgatory to get him out of purgatory earlier. Now we know that the only person who can pay for your sins is Jesus Christ. The death on the cross, that work is substitutionary, okay? So the death on the cross is substitutionary. Christ's death on the cross is substitutionary. The priests were saying, my Hail Marys do the same thing, just not as much, but you got to pay me to get them. Okay, so Luther says, well, that's not right. Okay, and the Catholic Church didn't always teach that, but this practice had arisen at this time. And it was a way, again, for the church to make money. So on October 31st, Halloween, that's Halloween, isn't it? Halloween Eve. 1031. October 31st, 1517, Luther goes over to the church, the Wittenberg Church, and which was like the bulletin board, the town bulletin board, and he nails these disagreements on the bulletin board and then sends a copy of them to his bishop, because he's posting it. He's saying, I don't think he's trying to be, well, he's probably trying to be a little ornery about it, but he's placing it out there, and he's saying, what we're doing is wrong, okay? He's a Bible teacher, and so he's been entrusted to teaching the truth to seminary students. So he says, whoa, what we're doing is wrong. And so he says to the church, what we're doing is wrong. Look, I teach this stuff for a living, and there's nothing about this in the Bible. We just made this up. And of course, Catholic Church is saying, no, the Pope said we can do it, okay? And the Pope is on an equal, the Catholic Church and Pope and the Bible are on equal footing. Church history, church tradition, and Bible are equal in the Catholic Church. It's another issue with Catholic Church. And so he challenges the Pope's authority to grant, not the Pope's authority, but the Pope's authority to grant indulgences, and basically says, folks, you're spending your money on these things. They're not going to do your loved ones in purgatory. It's not going to do any good. It's not going to get them out any faster. None of this works. It's snake oil. So he sends a copy off to the bishop, and the idea is he's going to send this to the bishop. The bishop's going to read it. The bishop's going to say, wow, that Martin Luther is such a brilliant theologian. Well, yeah, we need to change this. We need to reform things right now. That's not what happens, though. The bishop gets it, and Luther gets no reply from the bishop. Crickets chirping. Then somebody gets a hold of the 95, so the bishop ignores them. Then somebody, I'm sure other people did the same thing. Hey, look, I'm reading the Bible. This doesn't say what it's supposed to say. But the difference is that the printing press had been invented in 1450. This is 1517. And so printing presses sprung up all over the place. There were, when there was only one or two presses, there was a long line for things to get printed. Now, if you want to make a lot of money, just go buy a printing press and open up a print shop. It is the equivalent today of having a cell phone shop or having a computer shop or software company, okay? If you want to make a lot of money, buy a printing press and print things. So people were looking for stuff to print. So lo and behold, somebody takes a copy, may have taken the copy off the Wittenberg door, or maybe they went up to the Wittenberg door and copied down the 95 Theses. Anyway, so what happens is that in the time that he sent this off to the bishop never replies. Someone copied them down and took them to a printer, and a printer distributed them. That lights the fire. After that, things are going nutty, and from his superiors, Luther gets the instructions that he has to recant, and Luther says, "I'm not going to recant. What this says is what I wrote is true. It's not in the Bible." And so that happens in 1519 to show you how slowly things happen. 1517, he prints, he pastes the 95 Theses, nails or pastes it on the Wittenberg door. 2 years later, he's told to recant. 3 years later, it's 1520 now, he is excommunicated from the church, because it takes a while for these things to happen. His position, though, becomes very popular, and he forms a new church called the Evangelical Church. That's what he calls it. It's known today in English as the Lutheran Church, Martin Luther's church, Lutheran Church. So we call it Lutheran Church. He called it the Evangelical Church. So many countries follow and followed him and make Lutheranism their state religion. Music in Lutheran Church. Luther wanted to give the laity an increased role in the service. He kept the parts of the liturgy kept parts of it in Latin, but translated other parts to German so people could understand it. Luther loved music, loved Josquin, and he was himself. He played instruments. He's supposed to have a nice voice, and he also was a composer of some skill. He wasn't a composer on the level of some of the other guys who studied, but he was a real composer. So he brought in German hymns in the vernacular, okay, to replace parts of the Mass. So what was going on in the Mass, again, we talk about the Mass proper, the Mass ordinary, which is the 5 parts that are composed, and then the other parts too. In the Mass of the proper, or the Mass proper, some of those parts are composed, but they are changing parts. The proper changes with the year. The ordinary stays the same. Okay, so the proper has all parts of the Mass have places where you can inject hymns, and so he replaces parts of the Mass with hymns. So instead of doing the Mass, they do hymns. And then the Lutheran chorale. Chorale is a congregational hymn in German. That's the first thing you need to remember. It's the most important music in the Lutheran Church. It still is. So a chorale, but I grew up Lutheran, and in the Lutheran Church, we call hymns, but they're basically what they are is chorales, okay? So the proper name for a Lutheran hymn, the way that it's normally practiced, is a chorale. It's just German. Of course, we don't sing them in German. We sing them in English in a Lutheran church in America in vernacular. But at this time, vernacular was German for these guys. 4-part, strophic poem, simple melody. They start out in unison, but they go to these 4 parts. They start out as unison strophic tunes, and then go to these harmonizations. Bach is famous for his chorales. Bach's chorales are simply Lutheran hymns, because of course Bach was a Lutheran, worked for the church. So 4-part becomes the norm. The main sources, and you've heard, Lutheran hymns are drinking songs. That's not exactly true. They're the 4 main sources, and to any great extent, but the 4 main sources of chorales are, first of all, that he took chants. Luther and other people that were writing this music, but Luther did a lot of this music. So Luther and his contemporaries that were writing for the Lutheran Church, they took adaptations of chant. They take an existing chant and write a hymn out of it. Then there were existing German devotional songs. So there might be a German devotional song to Mary, and they would take that and turn it into a chorale. Then there were secular songs given new words. Those are called contrafactum. 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 Contrafactum is a secular song given new words. Now, were some of those drinking songs, it's better to say that they were popular songs, and they happened to sing them in the bars because they were popular songs. So if you're in the bar and you had a few too many brewskis and you started to sing, what are you going to sing? You're not going to sing Ave Maria. You're not going to sing a mass setting. You're going to sing a pop song. So these songs, so not all the secular songs, there's a lot of secular songs that you might not sing in the bar, but all pop music became fair game. Even when I was a new Christian, I was going to a little Bible church, new Bible church. At that time, they were taking songs, secular songs, and setting Christian words to the secular songs. One of the ones, maybe I shared it with this class. I know I shared it with my worship literature class. One of the songs we used to sing, which even when I was in my 20s drove me crazy because I thought it was awful. But there was a song by the Animals called "The House of the Rising Sun." There is a house in New Orleans, they call it the Rising Sun. Okay, so it's a 60s tune, 60s, 70s tune, and very secular. Okay, well, we used to sing Amazing Grace to that. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. It was hideous. Hideous at the time, still hideous. But that is what they were doing. That's what that's one of the things that was happening in the German church. Now, it would try to find appropriate songs to set to this music, but it's just one of the sources. Remember, they needed a bunch of stuff because it's a brand new church and they needed songs to sing. And then, of course, there were new compositions. They were writing new songs, newly composed music with newly composed words. I have 3 examples of hymns, chorale hymns, listed in your listening. One of those is Ein Festeberg, a huge mountain. And a huge mountain is a mighty fortress. A mighty fortress is our God. What's interesting is the tune goes da 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 da. It's got lots of syncopation in it. We don't sing it that way now, but that is the hymn, A Mighty Fortress. And the words are pretty similar. They haven't changed much. They just had to be translated into English. So, and that's Luther. Polyphonic chorale settings. Lutherans then started to set polyphonic chorale settings. Not going to go into much of that. I've got a couple examples in the bottom. By the end of the 16th century, the organ was playing all the voices, and the congregation sang the top in unison. That continues today. You go to a Lutheran service or a Catholic service too. I mean, you go to Baptist service if they're still using organ and hymnals. Somebody plays all 4 parts, and then you sing the top part. Okay, that starts in the Lutheran Church around the end of the 1500s, beginning of the 1600s. Okay, the Lutheran tradition. By 1600, there were over 700 chorale melodies, and there were versions of those chorale melodies that were very elaborate, that were adapted to the organ. They were basically arrangements for the organ. And these 700 chorale melodies, many of them are still in use today in the Lutheran Church. So if you happen to, and my brother is a Lutheran pastor, and my brother-in-law is an evangelical free pastor. So we've got a great time at Christmas when we all get together and pick apart each other's belief system. But if you can find go to a Lutheran church. Go step into a Lutheran church and go to a service and listen to the music. And what you're listening to, it's been updated, but that some of that stuff you're singing in a Lutheran church was written. And if you look at the bottom of the Lutheran hymnal, you'll see what the origins are and how old some of that music actually is. One of the challenges I had was I became a Christian as an adult. My wife and I became Christians at the same time. We were in our mid-20s when that happened, and it wasn't long after that. And I was working on a master's degree when that happened, and we started to go to a Bible church. And one of the challenges for me was I didn't know any of the music that these folks were singing, because it didn't come out of high church Lutheran stuff, chorale stuff that had been written 500 years ago. It was stuff that was low church stuff. It was music that was like House of the Rising Sun, Amazing Grace, the House of the Rising Sun. So and then now I'm a worship pastor at a Bible church that is kind of loosely evangelical free in its doctrine. And our hymnal is Sing to the Lord, very popular hymnal amongst churches. And my hymnal is well used. And the songs in here there's a little crossover, but for the most part, the stuff in an evangelical free or a Bible or a Bible church hymnal is not the same music in a Lutheran church hymnal. So I had to learn a whole new set of hymns, but that's cool. I like the music. Let's keep going. We're going to end early today. We'll get you through it, because I'm not going to take a break, because you can stop at any time you want to. Let's see. Music in the Calvinist churches. Okay. So John Calvin, 1509 to 1564. He believed in justification through faith alone, like Luther, but he also believed in predestination, that those who were condemned were condemned from the beginning of time, and those who were going to be saved were saved from the beginning of time. It's predetermined, which led to, that makes everybody a robot. So he stripped the churches of stuff that he considered was worldly. So he got rid of the vestments and the altar stuff, the robes. He got rid of the paintings and the statues. He got rid of instruments. They did stuff a cappella. He got rid of the stained glass windows. He got rid of all that stuff, very austere. And he valued congregational singing. So again, now the services are in the vernacular, and he would have been French, so it would have French speaker, so it would have been I believe should have been in French. So don't quote me on that, but I believe it was either German or French. I believe it was French. So in Switzerland, they speak 4 languages. So that's tough. So it depends on where you are from in Switzerland. Metrical Psalms, they're biblical texts, especially Psalms for singing. Okay. Settings of Psalms make them easier to sing. See if we can give you an example. What he did was he took a psalm, because they're already song tunes, but he would take a psalm and turn it into a metric, rhymed, strophic translation. So he'd take the original psalm, translate it into the vernacular, and it would have been French, because he was, yes. Okay, so he would have translated it into French and made a French poem out of the psalm, basically is what he was doing. And then take that and either write new music or adapt an existing chant tune for that. There were unaccompanied, there were monophonic. Remember, he got rid of the instruments. They were published in something called Psalters. And then he took all those, or people took those, and as Calvinism spreads, including to England, Calvinism goes to England too, the English translate it and make English psalters out of the French psalters, right? So they take the French tunes, French poems based on the Psalms, and make English versions of them. And those psalters, those English psalters, end up being brought to New England as the United States is being, later on, 50, 100 years later on, when the Pilgrims come and all that stuff is happening in New England, and they bring those psalters with them. Polyphonic psalm settings. Outside of the church, inside the church is monophonic, no instruments. Outside of the church, people took those same tunes and started to build these polyphonic compositions out of them. And it's like CCM today. So they would take the tunes and they would make polyphonic compositions so that if you came over for dinner, we could, back then you didn't have a radio or CD player or an MP3 player. So you would make music after dinner. So you might be my guest, you come over for dinner, or maybe the family would have dinner and then the mom and dad, the kids would get together and they would make these polyphonic arrangements of these metrical psalm tunes. And it was basically Christian popular music at the time. They did it because they liked it. They liked the music. It was fun. They were Christian. They liked the polyphony. It sounded good. It was fun to make the music. It was the Christian. It was the equivalent of CCM back then. Okay, church music in England. Okay, England's another place. Okay, another time. So King Henry VIII is desperate. He goes through wives pretty quickly, but the Reformation in England is more about politics at the beginning than it is about doctrine. So King Henry VIII is married to a gal by the name of Catherine of Aragon. He married her wanting an heir. He needed an heir, preferably a male heir, so he can pass the kingdom on to his son. That's what he's looking for. And he marries Catherine, doesn't get a baby. And Catherine finally gets to a point where she's too old to have children. So he goes, I need somebody who can give me a kid. But he's trying to follow the rules. The church is still in charge, Catholic Church. And he's trying to follow the rules. And he writes to the Pope and says, hey, I need to divorce this lady. I want you, and of course, you couldn't get divorced in the Catholic Church, but he could have the marriage annulled for different reasons. So he puts in and says, I need this marriage annulled so I can get married to somebody else so I can get a baby. I need a baby. And they say no. And he goes, okay. So he leaves the Catholic Church. He goes to the Parliament. He goes to the head of the English politics, the folks that are the English politicians, and he says, hey, I need an heir. We need to leave the Catholic Church because they won't let me get divorced. And so they said, they weren't crazy about that, but they said, okay, because King Henry was very powerful. And so he comes up with an alternative called the Church of England. And the Church of England basically is the Catholic Church without the head of the Catholic Church. So he does the Church of England, and it functions as the Catholic Church at the beginning, except that it allows divorce. So now he gets divorced. He gets married to who is it? let's see. After that, after Catherine, it's I didn't put it in my notes. Doesn't matter. He does have a son, and Henry's son becomes king, and then Henry's son, the mom, is basically a Protestant. She's bought into the Reformation, and she's a Protestant, Calvinist, I believe, and she influences the son of Henry, and the church service becomes basically Protestant. Okay, so they go from Catholic to Church of England, that's very Catholic, to Church of England that's not very Catholic, that's now Protestant. And then there's a series of heirs that are either Catholic or Protestant. And for a while, England goes back and forth between having Catholicism as the state religion and having basically Protestantism as the state religion. Ultimately, the Church of England is what we get. Anglican Church is what we would call it, Episcopalian in the United States. The Episcopalians are Anglicans, basically. So the Church of England ends up being a mishmash of Catholic and Protestant ideas. So if you can think of a way to stir that stuff together and keep it intact, that's why the Church of England is not, I mean, it's the only reason we have Episcopalians here is because of people that migrated from England and brought it with them. Otherwise, Church of England would only be in England. So the music of the Church of England, the church music, the guys that you need to be aware of, John Tavener, which is the first half of the 16th century, Thomas Tallis, which is the better part of the kind of the middle part of the 16th century, and then William Byrd, which is the last part of the 16th century into the early part of the 17th century. So Tavener and Tallis wrote masses, and Tallis wrote hymns. Tavener wrote motets, and they wrote other stuff, but that's basically what was going on. The church adopts English as the primary liturgical language, and two English parts of the service emerge. There's the service proper, and that certain parts of the Mass, Matins, and Evensong are called service, and that's now in English. And then the anthem is another English form. Still, the English still have it. We have anthems, and we'll use them for like openings of services. But the Church of England still has anthem as a musical form, and it's like a motet, except it's in English. So William Byrd, very important composer, 1540, 1623. William Byrd was a Catholic, and he worked for the court, the English court. So he wrote Anglican services. A Catholic, but he wrote Anglican services because that's what he was. He's a hired gun. That's what he was hired to do. So he also writes secular court music, vocal music, instrumental music. So William Byrd is hired to work for the court, the English court. So whoever, King Henry or whoever follows King Henry. And so he's writing stuff in English. Matter of fact, there's an example of one of his songs, "Sing Joyfully to the Lord, Unto the Lord," that's down in your listening. And he writes this music and lays low on the Catholicism, because at the time he's there, Protestantism, Anglicanism is the state religion. And if you were Catholic, there was kind of low-level persecution going on with Catholics. So he didn't talk about his Catholicism, but he had friends. Of course, when you're going back and forth, and sometimes imagine Kansas City, or imagine Missouri for 5 years is the state religion is Catholicism, and then the next 5 years it's Southern Baptist, and then it goes back to Catholicism, then it goes back to Southern Baptist. Okay, that's basically what's happening in England at the time. And so when the switches are made, there's people who don't switch. So there are plenty of Catholics living in England at the time, but they're doing it on the lowdown. They don't want people to know, because whoever's in charge, if you want to get along with whoever's in charge. And it wouldn't be any different here. We got the pandemic going on, so I don't want to wear a mask, or I do want to wear a mask. It doesn't matter. If you have to wear a mask, you wear a mask because you don't want to get fined. So it doesn't matter what your position is. I want to wear a mask, or I don't want to wear a mask. Well, right now the law says you have to wear a mask if you're out in public, so you wear a mask. At least in Kansas City it is. It's different down in Raytown, or down in Belton and Raymore. So, okay, so he has Catholic friends. He's Catholic. He's still meeting for Catholic services in secret, not telling anybody. And so he's writing Catholic service music also, along with the Anglican church music. So he writes Latin masses and motets, and that's what he's best known for. His best, William Byrd's best output are the Latin masses and Latin motets. So Catholic church music, we're going to the next one. There's not a lot of changes going on in Catholic church music. Willert, Gombert, Clemens are all writing. They're all writing 4-6 voice, imitative polyphony, usually in duple meter, sometime in triple meter. And it's music that sounds like the music that's been going on all along. The Catholic church music is like the Catholic church. It's very stable in what they were what they were commissioning from their composers, and the church service changed very little. Now, there are some things that happened in the Catholic Church, and that's called the Counter-Reformation. So Luther and then Calvin led the Reformation, and then in the Catholic Church, they had a Counter-Reformation. And that Counter-Reformation did a couple things. The first thing is they borrowed from the Calvinists and went back to this kind of austere, simple church service and churches. They got rid of the excess and the extravagance, because there was a lot of money being spent in churches on huge organs and vestments and huge stained glass windows and opulence. The church was practicing this kind of religious opulence at the time, and they got rid of all of that. So that's one of the first things they did. And then they founded a group of monks called the Jesuits. The Jesuits are still with us today. This is 1534. And the Jesuits are known as the academics of the Catholic Church, and they set up universities and other schools to go teach. And they also become kind of the missionaries for the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church sends the Jesuits out to actually proselytize, or to actually try to reconvert people back to Catholicism. Or if people don't belong to any religion, try to convert them to Catholicism. So that's the Jesuits. So that was the Counter-Reformation. And then they have the Council of Trent. So the Counter-Reformation starts, and then they have the Council of Trent, which is 1545 to 1564. So this is maybe 30 years after Luther wrote the 95 Theses. And the Council of Trent is a gathering of the church leaders, church fathers, Catholic church fathers of the time, and they try to hammer out a response to what's going on with the Reformation. And they really notch it up. Okay, so the Jesuits are already operating. They've already tried to bring back some simplicity and austerity to the services, but now they're trying to show the world why Catholicism is superior to all these other spin-offs. And one of the things they do is they reaffirm their doctrinal positions. They actually come out and say, everything we said before, we still believe. That's the first thing. But they got rid of the abuses, okay? So even though, I mean, basically Catholic Church, and I'm not a Catholic Church expert, but the Catholic Church understood that the letters of indulgences were abusive. And so they got rid of a lot of stuff that had cropped up that was extra biblical, and they dumped it. They reaffirmed the standard liturgy, and you remember tropes and sequences are add-ons to existing chant. Well, they eliminated almost all the tropes and sequences. They kept a couple that they really liked, but everything else they got rid of, and went back to the original stuff. They got rid of, at this point, the music is polyphonic. I mean, they have the chants, but at this point, the music is polyphonic. The mass and motets that they're using are, and we've talked all about that. They do very little to change that, but they do get rid of stuff that's considered lascivious. So if there was, if it was lascivious or impure, so if there was something about a piece of music that was questionable, they tossed it. So basically they did a purging. They didn't change much, but they purged out the stuff that was questionable. And then there were, you'll read that they went to Palestrina and said they were going to get rid of polyphonic music, and Palestrina said, no, don't. I'll write this mass, Pope Marcellus Mass, and I'll make it so that it's easier to understand the text, because they were saying that the text wasn't understandable. The truth is the Council of Trent didn't get rid of that, but there were some local church authorities that said the music is too busy. We need to simplify it, and so Palestrina started writing music that, instead of, it was still polyphonic, it had individual voices, but he would write those polyphonic pieces so that the words lined up. So instead of having Kyrie, or Gloria in excelsis Deus, da 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 da, and then the next line starts out Gloria in excelsis Deus, da 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 da. What would happen was he would start out Gloria in excelsis Deo, et pax hominibus, the next line, et pax hominibus. Well, when the next voice came in, it came in on the same words as the first voice, et pax hominibus. So that as the voices stacked and they built polyphony, all the voices were singing the same text, and it made it a whole lot easier to understand the words, because you didn't have multiple text streams going on at the same time. So that's what's going on there. Pope Marcellus Mass is, they call that in the new manner, or in a new manner. That is the perfect example of it. So where the text aligns vertically for greater clarity. Palestrina, the very first day of class, I mentioned that there are some major themes that go on in music. God to monarch to men, gods to monarchs to men was one of them. The idea that music swings back and forth between progressive and conservative elements, or times when between romantic and logical elements, the doctrine of ethos, Apollo and Dionysus, that stuff, and but the idea that composers are either culminators, mainly culminators, or innovators. Palestrina is, like I say, is a lot like Bach. Not, I mean, his music actually influenced Bach greatly, but Palestrina is a major composer. He is to the Renaissance what Bach is to the Baroque. Palestrina, 1525 or 6, somewhere in there, to 1594. So he lasts for second half, for most of the 16th century. Leading composer of Italian music, he's Italian. His most famous work is the Pope Marcellus Mass, linked below in your listening stuff. I keep going like this because that's where it is on my notes. And Palestrina, like Bach and like Brahms, was a culminator. Palestrina wasn't out to invent new styles or new ways of writing music. Palestrina was out to make the music that was being written the very best it could be, and he succeeded. He writes 104 masses. He writes, some of those are imitation, some are paraphrase, some are cantus firmus style masses. He wrote motets, and he wrote in all the other genres that were in vogue at the time. His music is it's pleasing, it's serene, it's transparent. You can hear what he's doing. There's an elegance to his writing. There's a clarity to his writing. He values the text over the music, but the music is brilliant. There's a lot of variety in texture. So there might be a single voice singing and then 2 or 3 or 4, and then back to 2 voices. Maybe they're pitched higher, maybe they're pitched lower. He fully explores everything that's going on. His harmonic vocabulary is pretty simple and limited. He doesn't do anything outrageous harmonically, but his brilliance is in how he crafts a piece of music and how creative he is. Okay, so the most important composer of the 16th century, and I would say probably it's not. I would say that he is as important to the Renaissance as Bach is to the Baroque. It's really not fair to say that Baruch was the greatest composer of the Baroque, though he was. Probably not fair to say that about Palestrina, because when you're at the beginning of a style period and all this turmoil's going on, it's hard for music. It's hard for anybody to write definitive music in any particular style because there is no particular style that's really grabbed hold. Well, by the time we get to Palestrina, that's happened. So he's an incredible composer, not because of his innovation, but because of how he brings together all of these elements of the Renaissance and some stuff that's carried over from the medieval, and crafts the most beautiful music that just beautiful that's come out of the church. Certainly, this is the best church music that was written and still is today. So there's nothing like this that comes out of churches today. So his style is so distinctive. Palestrina sounds so Palestrina-ish that he's still being imitated. So if somebody wants to write a movie music, so if I were a movie music composer, and I wanted to write music for new music for a scene that takes place in a cathedral, and I'm trying to hearken to this kind of old, ancient, religious, sacred church music, I'd want to sound like Palestrina. I would imitate him. So that still goes on today. Like I said before, and I'll say it again, when we think of church music of the Renaissance, we think Palestrina. That's what we're hearing in our heads when we say that. And then his ideal was something called stile antico, which means the old style. That's the style he wrote in. just like Bach. When Bach was writing his stuff, he was considered an old fuddy-duddy at the end of his life. He was still writing in the old style when there was absolutely a new style that had emerged. But Bach was still writing in the old style, just like Palestrina. There was a new style emerging at the time he was writing, but Palestrina was writing stile antico, in the old style. All right, Spain and the New World. Spain, strongly Catholic. Spain stayed Catholic. There's no Reformation going on in Spain. 1480, the Spanish Inquisition is started to root out heresy. As a matter of fact, Spain does the exact opposite of the Reformation. They double down. So in 1480, the Spanish Inquisition is started. And of course, this is before the Reformation starts. But the Spanish Inquisition starts. They're brutal. They're looking for anybody who speaks out and says anything that they find offensive about the Catholic Church. And if they find you and you've done that, we're not talking just they fine you a few bucks. I mean, the penalty is severe, all the way to death. Okay, that's the Spanish Inquisition. So Catholic music in Spain. Thomas Luis de Victoria is the best-known Spanish composer of the 16th century. He wrote, he only wrote music for the church. He wrote masses and motets and other stuff. So he was specifically a church musician and church writer. His most famous work is O Magnum Mysterium. If you've been in choirs at all, there's a pretty good chance that you've sung O Magnum Mysterium. I've conducted it. I've sung it in choirs. It's a standard high school choir piece and college choir piece. O Magnum Mysterium, linked to the bottom, or linked in the listening stuff over in Canvas. Music in the Spanish New World. So remember, Columbus comes over. He lands in like the Bahamas. Okay, so Columbus doesn't land in West Virginia. Columbus lands in the Bahamas, and then claims he makes 4 trips, and he claims parts of where he lands for Spain. So it's basically then what follows are the conquistadors. Conquistador means conqueror. So the Spanish conquistadors come over and follow after Columbus, and they colonize Mexico and Peru. Mexico are the Aztecs, and Peru are the Incas, and basically act as missionaries to these areas. But they're pretty vicious missionaries. So they come over and proselytize all these Indian tribes. So that's what's, and then they import the Catholic masses and motets over to those people, and they actually like it. I mean, they probably don't like being subdued by the Spanish, but they like the music. They like making the music, and they like learning how to make the music. And so the masses and motets click in, and that's why Mexico is Catholic. And so it's because of that transference of stuff from Spain. And then I have, just as a side note, better to say that Columbus found the Americas and introduced them to Europe. Of course, the Americas were already here, and there were already indigenous people, Aztecs and Incas in Peru and Mexico. The Bahamas, I don't know so much in the Bahamas. There was an indigenous people, I can't remember that, and the Catholics basically wiped them out. So, Columbus never really sets foot in the U.S., but he sets out for China, but what he discovers is this big coastline that is Central and South America, Venezuela, and sets up the, and then eventually he ends up doing trade and and he thinks he landed on in China, but the world's bigger than what he realized. So that's all Spanish. Okay, Germany and Eastern Europe. Southern Germany, Northern Germany becomes Lutheran. Southern Germany stays Catholic, and so the music doesn't really change aside from what we talked about with the Counter-Reformation. There are some fine German composers. Hans Leo Hassler is one of those. Orlando de Lassus, or you'll see Orlando di Lasso. He is one of the great 16th century composers of church music. He's up there with Palestrina, very well respected. But Orlando de Lassus is born in France. He serves in Italy, Bavarian, Germany. He's very well trained. He's very popular at the time. He writes 57 masses, 700 motets, over 100 magnificats, other sacred literature. He wrote French chanson, Italian madrigals, German lieder, and there's no specific style. He was like a virtual musical chameleon. He would write in whatever style of music that he was writing at the time. So it's very adaptable, really brilliant composer, and very important composer. Okay, we're going on to Jewish music. What were the Jews doing? Let's see. Singing of psalms to traditional formulas. And they performed this stuff responsorily. So they would have a cantor, they still do, and the person would cant. Matter of fact, I have a friend from college who's a cantor, a Jewish cantor. She's a cantress. So she's a Jewish cantor works at the synagogue, sings the services. So she sings a text, and then the congregation sings the answer back. She sings another text, they sing the answer back. And so that's responsorial singing. A lot of the Jewish music was passed down orally. Wasn't written down, it was passed down orally. Gregorian chant style ultimately seeped into the service music. Yes, okay. Just as the Jewish service music influenced early Christian service music, obviously because they were Jews, and so they're naturally going to bring over the Jewish stuff that they were using in their services that they could apply to the Christian service, and then write the new stuff that they had. And then the opposite occurs as time goes on and Christian music develops. It starts to spill back over in the Jewish religion. Okay, let's tie it all together and we'll be all done with this. The legacy of 60, what I have are notes, and I did, okay, talk about this. So I hope I gave you all the information. Trust your book, because what I'm trying to do is use your book as an outline so I don't go too far off track. Otherwise, I'd go all over the place. So I'm trying to give you the information that's in the book. If you hear me say something that goes counter to the book, follow the book. The book is right. If I say something that's wrong in a lecture, it's not because necessarily my notes are wrong. It's because I misread something and took a wrong turn, which I'm perfectly capable of doing. I do it all the time. So sometimes even when I drive. So the legacy of 16th century sacred music. Here's the bottom line for this chapter. The religious conflicts of the 16th century continue today. Northern Ireland is a perfect example of that, where you have, as I mentioned before, Catholics and Protestants beating the living tar and sometimes killing each other. That's not nearly as bad as it was. When I was younger, when I was in my 20s, there were deaths occurring on both sides often. It was a horrible, horrible situation. October of 1999, the Catholic and Lutheran churches officially declared an end to their dispute. Now they've declared an end. It isn't so much all the way to the point where if you're a Lutheran, you can go to Catholic service and take communion, It hasn't gotten to that point, but it has gotten to that point with Church of England. Remember, Church of England is a mix of Catholic and Lutheran or Protestant ideas. The Church of England is allowed the priests, the Church of England, have been allowed to marry. Okay, so the Church of England, you can be a reverend or a pastor in the Church of England and have a wife. Well, the Catholics are so low on priests, they now allow Church of England pastors to come in and do priest duties and do communion for Catholic services because their belief systems are so close, and they allow them to stay married. So, which is making all the other priests over the Catholic Church wonder why can't they get married too, right? Hey, he got a candy bar. Why can't I get a candy bar too? I mean, that's how life works, and that's how we're wired. So, so eventually, Catholics are probably going to allow their priests to get married. They already allow deacons to get married and then perform some of that. So it's coming. They keep lightening up on it. It'll take a while. At least that's what I see happening. Lutheran music of the time becomes the basis of much of Bach and other composers' music of the Baroque. This is the music we just talked about, is very much echoes through the Baroque period. Many of the Calvinist tunes of the time are still in use in the church today. So if you can go to a Calvinist church, like a Presbyterian church or another one of the other Calvinist spin-offs, Presbyterian church would be fine. You can hear some of the same tunes and look down in the Calvinist hymnal and look and see the dates on some of these songs that they've dated. Some of the settings that they have. And the Catholic and Church of England compositions are still in use in services today also. So that's everything I have. This will go up tonight. It's 5:30 right now. So I'll put the service up I'll put the this class up. And if you're watching this, expect the test shortly, within the next 24 hours. So maybe even tonight, probably tomorrow morning. So Monday morning. Okay, have a good Labor Day. And or if it's after Labor Day, I hope you had a good Labor Day. And we'll see you next Monday. For next Monday, read through chapter 13. So 11, 12, and 13. We might not get all the way through 13, but we will do 11 and 12. So have a good day.